This Feeling by LeilahMoon, read by LMX Mabella. Chapter 8. Once all the food had been consumed, Dumbledore stood up and asked the students to do the same. Then, with a wave of his wand, the tables zoomed back along the walls, leaving the floor clear. He then conjured a raised platform into existence along the right-hand wall. A set of drums, several guitars, a lute, and some bagpipes were set up on it. The Weird Sisters trooped up onto the stage to wildly enthusiastic applause. They were all extremely hairy and dressed in black robes that had been artfully ripped and torn. They picked up their instruments, and in the same moment the lanterns dimmed. It was time for the Champions' Waltz. Victor was very courteous, and kept his hand firmly on Hermione's waist the entire time. It was a pleasant enough experience, but she wasn't interested in moving any closer to him, as some of the couples around them had started to do. As he twirled her in a neat circle, Hermione noticed Draco lean inconspicuously by the stage, asking one of the Weird Sisters something. She nodded enthusiastically and turned to pass the message along. Draco slunk quickly off, looking pleased with himself. It didn't take very long before the music quietened, and the leader singer called out,
"In the style of Regency dance, please can everyone change partners? Choose the person nearest to you."
Everyone looked slightly perplexed, nonetheless glanced around to select another partner.
"Granger,"
a voice drawled behind her.
"Looks like you're stuck with me."
Hermione struggled to keep her face neutral and refrain from throwing herself at Draco as she turned around. "Come here," she whispered, only for his ears. He stepped slowly towards her and gripped her waist in his hands, pulling her close. She melted into him and twined her arms around his neck.
"You're perfect,"
Draco breathed, his lips just inches from her forehead. She was too focused on the way his body felt against hers to reply. They fit effortlessly together.
"Is this okay?" he murmured. "Your heart is pounding."
"This is more than okay." The music eventually lulled, and the two were forced to separate. Draco watched morosely as Victor stole Hermione from him, and Pansy was clutching his arm again. 3 dances later, Hermione made her way over to Harry and Ron. "It's hot, isn't it?" she said, fanning herself. "Victor's just gone to get some drinks."
Ron gave her a withering look. "Victor?" he said. "Hasn't he asked you to call him Vicky yet?"
"What are you on about?"
"He's from Durmstrang," spat Ron. "He's competing against Harry, against Hogwarts. You're fraternizing with the enemy. I even saw you dancing with bloody Draco Malfoy. What's wrong with you?"
"Don't be so stupid. The enemy?"
"Yeah, I bet they're both just trying to get information on Harry. It'll be your fault when something bad happens to him."
Hermione stared incredulously at the redhead, but he just carried on.
"Are you going to tell Vicky about the next task? I suppose you've been putting your hats together during those cozy little library sessions."
Tears began filling her eyes as she stormed off across the dance floor and fled the great hall. Hermione had found a small alcove not far from the hall, and stood with her face pressed against the cold window. She was beginning to feel a bit foolish for running out so dramatically when a familiar voice called her name. "I'm in here," she responded. Draco pushed aside the heavy curtain concealing the alcove and stepped quickly towards her. He placed his hands on her shoulders and looked down at her, his brows furrowed in concern.
"What happened? Are you okay?"
Welling up again as she replied, Hermione said, "Oh, yes, fine." Draco raised an eyebrow.
"If that's what constitutes as lying in Gryffindor, I really don't know how you managed to get away with so much."
"It's stupid."
"Tell me, please."
Hermione sniffed and brushed a tear away. "Ron said I was fraternizing with the enemy for dancing with you and Victor. I just had such an amazing time with you, and I started wondering," she trailed off, "well, just whether they would ever accept us as friends or anything else." She tilted her head up. There was still tears shining in her eyes. Gently, Draco placed one of his warm hands against her cheek. She shivered and leaned into his touch.
"Or anything else?" he said softly.
Hermione's gaze was drawn to his mouth as he spoke. She blushed and looked back into his storm-grey eyes. He was beautiful. Bending closer, Draco could smell her familiar vanilla scent. He brushed his lips softly against hers. She gave a small gasp and pressed ever so slightly forward. Heart pounding, his hand slid down her sides to grip her waist. "Draco," she whispered, breath hitching as he deepened the kiss. Hermione's lips parted and his tongue grazed the edge of her mouth. He shuddered and groaned softly, low in his throat. Her whole body tingled, relishing the feeling of him pressed against her as she melted into his form. Suddenly, there were footsteps echoing in the corridor, and they both stilled. A group of excited students passed the alcove, chatting loudly, and eventually their voices faded away. Leaning his forehead against hers, Draco wound an arm around her head and pulled out the clips that restrained her hair. Falling loose, he sighed contentedly and curled a lock around his fingers. "I've wanted to do that for such a long time." "Liberate my hair," she teased. He ran a finger gently across her lips. "You know what I mean." "I do, and me too." Draco pulled Hermione down onto his lap as he sat on the stone ledge which extended out from one wall of the alcove. She leaned her head on his shoulder and her eyes fluttered close. "You're tired. We should start heading upstairs." She hummed her assent, but nestled further into his embrace. When they finally disentangled themselves and withdrew from the alcove, Hermione realized how late it was. The castle was completely silent. A thrill went through her as she laced her fingers with his. She knew the chances of them being caught were very slim. They reached the entrance to the Gryffindor common room entirely too quickly. Hermione stood on her tiptoes to place a chaste kiss on Draco's lips, and he murmured good night as she caught one last glimpse of him before stepping through the portrait hall. To be continued. Thank you for listening to today's chapter of This Feeling by LeilahMoon, read by LeilahMoon. If you would like to stay up to date on upcoming chapters and stories, you can follow me on YouTube, Spotify, AO3, Instagram, or Tumblr.